Continuing production of The Open Mind has been made possible by grants from Ann Olnick Gumowitz, the Angelson Family Foundation, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, the Joan, Ganz, Cooney and Peter G. Peterson Fund, the Rosalind P. Walter Foundation, the Joanne and Kenneth Wellner Foundation, Sally Minard and Norton Garfinkle, and from the corporate community, Mutual of America.
I'm Alexander Heffner, your host on The Open Mind. Today's guest and I share a proud intergenerational bond. And those of you who've watched this program know, I succeeded in the moderator's chair my grandfather, who enjoyed his intellectual exchanges on The Open Mind with the father of my guest. Michael A. Peterson, whom we're delighted to welcome today, carries forward his family's vision for a sound American fiscal future. President and Chief Executive Officer of the Peter G. Peterson Foundation, Michael directs its strategy, initiatives, partnerships, and long-term objectives, all to increase public awareness of the nature and urgency of key fiscal challenges threatening America's future, and also to accelerate action on them. Despite the Obama administration's efforts to pare down the national debt, the Fiscal Confidence Index fell to below 50% this year, according to the latest poll released by the foundation. The millennial generation has the most at stake in building a vibrant, thriving economy of the future, Peterson said recently, when announcing, in collaboration with the Clinton Global Initiative, My 2 Cents Day, a first-of-its-kind nationwide mobilization to increase our fiscal literacy. The questions first to Michael Peterson. I want to ask him if we've yet to experience the severe repercussions of the debt crisis, that ticking time bomb he identifies. And if inaction continues, when does he anticipate the bomb will go off? And welcome. Thanks so much for being here, Michael.
Well, thank you for having me. Well, I think the goal is to not have the bomb go off at all, so I don't really want to predict doomsday or what day that will arrive. I think the simple fact is we have a very fundamental fiscal challenge with the federal budget. And it's based primarily on very predictable drivers of the debt. And at its most basic terms, we have a baby boom generation that's beginning to retire. There's 76 million of them. And as you know, a significant portion of the federal budget is dedicated towards taking care of our retirees and Social Security and Medicare and other very important programs. So we've got this huge influx of retirees that we've known about for quite some time. Secondly, they're all living much longer, and that's great news. However, it doesn't mean we have more years in retirement. So you've got a bigger population who's spending more years in retirement. When we first started the Social Security system, the retirement age was 65 and life expectancy was about 64. So it led to a pretty sustainable system. Now the retirement age is up to about 67, I guess, on average, but life expectancy at birth today is closer to 80 years old. So we have a much bigger generation of people who are all living much longer. And the third major driver of the long-term debt is our healthcare system. So America has the most inefficient healthcare system in the world. We spend about 18% of our economy on healthcare. Most other advanced countries spend about 9.5%. So we spend a huge amount more of our economy either as a share of the economy or per capita. And we have health outcomes that really are no better than these other countries. So there's a lot of waste in the system and a lot of inefficiency. And as you know, retirees in their later years typically consume more healthcare dollars, as they should. But you put those three things together, a bigger generation of people living much longer, operating in a healthcare industry here and healthcare sector that's highly inefficient, and you have a very predictable gap between the revenues the government's going to be taking in over the coming decades and the level of spending that's projected. So that's the overall fiscal challenge. There's a lot of confusion about it because deficits have come down in recent years. So I mean, it is a complex subject matter to get across. So some people Obviously, when we had the financial crisis in 2008, it has a huge impact on the budget because that in fact impacts both revenue and spending. So the slowdown in the economy reduces incomes, people lose their jobs, less spending going on, so revenues come down dramatically, but also spending goes up because of other things we have to do, unemployment and so forth, so it kind of has a double whammy effect on the budget. So we had trillion-dollar deficits immediately after the financial crisis. Those are down considerably, which is great news. However, this is really short-term stuff, and just because the deficit's less than it was doesn't mean we don't have a long-term problem. So that's the general issue we're trying to bring greater attention to so that we can deal with these challenges. So my answer is let's hope doomsday doesn't happen. And the good news about this is that there's a lot of things we can do as long as we get at it sooner rather than later.
Right. So your goal now in terms of the public awareness is to demystify the issue and has been. Let's start with the first of those three areas you identified. Can deficit reform and your approach, can that coexist with what we would like to preserve as a safety net for those older citizens? Can those two things coexist?
Absolutely. I mean, I would argue that if you don't deal with this, your safety net is in jeopardy. We all know that in a fiscal crisis, things can happen to the budget. We can be in a situation where we have to make immediate cuts that are unintelligent. And I would argue if we have a sound fiscal footing, and we don't need to do that, and wouldn't do that. It's when you may have a debt crisis, you may have an economic crisis that's caused in part by the debt crisis, that you might have to do unfortunate things, and therefore the safety net's in jeopardy. And I would say one example is the sequestration that occurred. This was all self-inflicted because we were dealing with brinksmanship in Washington and so forth, and they put in place, remember the so-called super committee and all these measures, and no one expected sequestration to happen, but sequestration did happen, and they slashed across the board and cut a lot of programs, but I don't think anybody really would have cut it quite that way if we had had control of the budget in a more strategic sense. So I would argue that's one example of where you have fiscal uncertainty causing cuts in programs that don't make sense. So I would argue anyone who cares about the safety net should be very focused on preserving it and making sure that we have a sound fiscal footing for the future.
And so you want legislators to be judicious and methodical and thoughtful in the way they're approaching this problem. So my question to you is, how do we pave the path towards a bipartisan understanding, not even action, just understanding that these things can be framed and we're all living on the same planet?
Well, this is what we struggle with every day. I mean, there's a lot of misunderstanding and misinformation and a lot of politics surrounding this. This is, of course, our budget, so it's basically a discussion of our entire federal government. What we try to do is, first of all, we're very much nonpartisan. There's obviously a lot of political polarization in Washington today that's quite destructive and a real challenge for the government to operate. So we decided at the outset of our foundation to be nonpartisan because there's very few organizations like ours who are operating on that basis. So we work with think tanks from across the political spectrum. We work with Democrats and Republicans and so forth. Secondly, we try to come with a lot of information and data. So we have a set of a few hundred charts of different ways to look at the budget and so forth. So we try to, the numbers speak for themselves. There's really no denying this problem. There's a lot of ways to look at it and a lot of considerations to think through as you're thinking about how to implement solutions. But the numbers speak for themselves. So bringing forth information is one of our key roles. And then lastly, we do a lot of work with policy institutions to try to come up with solutions. One of our signature initiatives at the Peterson Foundation is something we call the Solutions Initiative. And in that initiative, we gave grants to 6 different think tanks, again, from across the political spectrum. And we said, do whatever you want to the federal budget, and we'll measure debt as a share of GDP in 10 years and 25 years. And on our current path, according to the Congressional Budget Office, debt is skyrocketing to, over the coming decades, gets close to 200% of GDP. And most economists suggest keeping it below 60. So this is way out of line with whatever anyone would call a reasonable and sustainable level of debt. So that's our baseline. And we gave these grants, and they spent months working out their own versions of the budget, doing whatever they want. We had no restrictions whatsoever. And every single one of them solved the problem. They, of course, had differences in terms of the policy mix and some different outcomes, but they were all within a very successful band where the debt was stable and or coming down. I think the highest was in the 70% of GDP, the lowest was about 40% of GDP. So I think we proved there, A, we do have a problem, B, they all agreed it was unsustainable and not the right way to run a budget, and C, most importantly, there are a lot of ways to solve the problem.
So from that experience, what did you find was the most potentially successful way to do this? In this environment, we had the Bowles-Simpson effort. What is the greatest promise now for a bipartisan undertaking to tackle this issue?
There's a range of solutions. We just need to choose some combination of them that do the job.
Why did Bowles-Simpson's fail?
Well, I would argue it didn't fail entirely. I think they did, for a commission doing what they were trying to do with a bipartisan group, I think they had tremendous success. They had a supermajority that did vote in favor of it. They got people together like Tom Coburn on the right and Dick Durbin on the left, and they both agreed to vote in favor of it. They needed a bigger majority to put it to Congress by virtue of how it was organized. But I think it was a huge success in certain ways because they showed, again, they had another example of how we can solve the problem. It was a bipartisan solution, so it showed how two sides can come together. And I think it was a real benchmark on our issue because had that never happened, I think you know, the idea that there was a solution or a comparison, you know, it was a very useful comparison for all other plans and so forth. Why did it fail? Well, listen, this is a hard thing to do politically. I mean, you know, there's no, if you do it in a bipartisan fashion, there's no doubt about the fact that it has to include some revenue and some spending cuts. And if you're doing that by definition, you know, you're threatening the exact political priorities of each party. And in our opinion, it makes a lot of sense to do it because otherwise we have more taxes and less spending overall anyway because we haven't dealt with the problem. I mean, let's not forget that every year we wait, we pile on more and more debt. And debt brings with it interest expense. So interest expense means more taxes over time. And interest expense probably means less spending over time as it crowds out these other priorities. So some of these changes to the budget are going to be forced upon us. I think our argument is let's deal with it earlier so that we can do it more gradually and more thoughtfully, and let's get at it.
So to the extent that there was a failure, it was political will in the final analysis for a plan to achieve the support that would be signed by the president?
Well, listen, I don't want to get too specific about what happened because, you know, it's hard for anyone to know exactly why it failed. You know, obviously the parties didn't come together and agree on it, okay? Again, I think the commission itself did a great job putting forth the issue and solving it. What you're asking about is one of the hardest things for any Congress and presidential administration to come together to do. And I think the political polarization that we all see every day in Washington has made almost every issue difficult, from gun control to immigration to the budget. And what's really needed is a significant leadership on both sides to come together and for them to join hands and work together on solving these problems. But that's been a challenge for almost every policy issue over the last 8 or 10 years.
What is runaway spending?
How I would define runaway spending is heading towards insolvency. Okay? If you pick up any Social Security trustee report or Medicare trustee report, they will show that it has long-term insolvency, and over the coming decades we're facing an inability to pay the obligations. So to me, to make a bunch of promises and have no plans for how to pay for it is the definition of insolvency, and you could call that runaway spending if you wish. If you look at what's causing the problem, as I said earlier, it's the entitlement growth is 100% of the growth in the spending over the long term, other than interest. So that's the cause of this. However, the solutions can involve any number of things. We can actually lower other discretionary defense spending to help pay the bills. So it doesn't have to be entirely taken out of those programs. And of course, there's a revenue opportunity too. So if the entire country wanted all that spending, we could raise the revenue to do that. I think if you look at a consensus of Americans, there's probably a vast majority that would like to do some combination of both. So
you mentioned defense. What's the foundation's position on defense spending as the current status quo?
Well, listen, I think our view is that everything needs to be on the table. Okay, the best solutions look comprehensively at the budget, at all aspects, from revenue, all the sides of the revenue issue and on the spending issue. And at the Peterson Foundation, honestly, our strategy has been from the beginning not to have a Peterson plan. As I said earlier, we sponsor work of other organizations to come up with plans. We are fostering greater and more solutions, so we're all about solutions. But we felt that in order to serve in that role, it's probably better for us not to have a seventh plan that has our name on it. And in our view, it's not all that additive to the discussion, and it puts us in a slightly different role. We'd like to be the convener and the gatherer. Every year we have a fiscal summit in Washington. We'll have our sixth one this year. And we bring together these different think tanks and speakers from all sides. So we see ourselves as a facilitator, a convener, and a funder. So we don't have a Peterson defense number that we put out there. But on defense, we did another 2 different projects in the defense area. One was we gathered former defense officials and again had them look at the defense budget and come up with a new strategy. I think one of the issues here is that we haven't had a revised strategy for the 21st century. So look comprehensively, even not just within the whole budget, but within defense, look at things like cyber and look at the current threats. A lot of the money in the Defense Department is based on threats from the last century. Mm-hmm. So we're all struggling with how to deal with new threats. I think the defense budget is not well aligned with that, and so they came out with some recommendations. So again, it was a Peterson-funded effort, and we're very interested in funding policy solutions, but we don't have a specific number that we put out there.
And in terms of revenue, what's the most palatable argument to the American public that you're finding through the grants that you give and the studies that you convene? Is there a way in which Americans would be responsive to the necessity, as part of this grand bargain, this great compromise of 2015 and beyond, to raise taxes?
Well, listen, as I said earlier, I think any bipartisan solution to this overall problem that is a viable one is going to involve some combination of spending and revenues. I think if you have a baby boom generation retiring and living longer, you could say, okay, we just need to cut the spending and they get less, but we do have obligations that we put forth, and I think most people feel Social Security and Medicare are vital programs for the country. So to say there's not going to be a penny more revenue, even though we have a much bigger population coming through, I think a lot of people disagree with that. So for those bipartisan solutions or those solutions from the left that have revenue, there's a great number of opportunities on the revenue side. I think we all would agree our tax code is not perfect. It's got many, many thousands of pages. It's incredibly complex. It's quite unfair. There's loopholes and so forth. I think the most prevalent sort of macro solution to the tax issue involves broadening the base and lowering the rates. So right now, we collect a lot of taxes, but we have a lot of tax deductions and loopholes and other things you can do to reduce your tax burden. Those are called tax expenditures. And actually, we have about $1.4 trillion of tax expenditures every year. So that's like spending in the tax code. So you're basically saying if you do this type of business or mortgage deduction or charitable deduction, other things, you lower your tax burden. Many of the solutions involve eliminating some of them, eliminate all of them, some eliminate some of them, but reducing those substantially, okay, which increases the revenue base a lot, and then using some of that revenue to do 2 things. One, lower rates, so you can lower the tax rate as long as you have fewer deductions, and taking a portion of that and applying it towards reducing the debt and deficits over the long haul. So I think that's where we're headed. It does involve a comprehensive change to the tax code. The last time we did that was in the 80s. And again, we had leadership. You had Ronald Reagan, and you had Tip O'Neill, and Dan Rostenkowski, and you had real leaders in there pushing, and it was even very hard in that type of environment where they were working, I would say, better together than we are today. But those are some of the solutions on the revenue side.
In a climate in which the tax code, according to the American public, is rigged, like the way you're describing, unfairly, in a post-Citizens United climate that really doesn't give politicians the incentive to reform, either on the left or right, because they're pocketing funds from certain sources that want the tax code to remain the same, especially businesses that are exempt from the penalties and taxation and responsibilities that citizens have. So how do you motivate the politicians, because a great deal of your work is geared around that?
Well, again, it comes back to raising awareness about the challenge. I mean, we don't have a solution that doesn't involve any sacrifice or any pain, because that's fantasy land. And so I can't tell you can do that, but I think there's less pain in solving it than there will be in never solving it. And so you're really asking a question about political will. I mean, this is, I would say we have 2 challenges. One, we have a fiscal challenge that relates to how our budget is organized, how our tax code is organized, and how our entitlements are organized. But over that is a political challenge, which is how do we get anything done in Washington when there's so much polarization? We have these districts that are aligned in such a way that people are less incented to work together. I've seen these charts of the most liberal Republican and the most conservative Democrat, and even just a decade or two ago, there were a couple hundred members kind of in the middle. Now we're down to like a dozen members based on how they judge that. So we have a polarized Congress, and that makes anything hard. So I think, again, it's about raising more awareness about it, driving more leadership, having more conversations, putting out more policy solutions, and we're just going to keep at it. And we have another election coming up, obviously, in 2016, and our goal is to make it a big issue in that campaign so that 2017 becomes another opportunity.
From the outset, we were describing an Armageddon situation, which we quickly diverted course from. And I don't want to present such a gloomy picture, but the way that I drew an analogy about this is, and it's the same way that I know that you do, and advocates for action. It's an unsustainable model if you look at just the base of a family. A family can't survive. I don't think folks necessarily recognize the magnitude of the fiscal crisis, of the financial 07-08 situation. Breadlines would have been possible had it not been for bailouts of the banks. And I remember being at the University of Nebraska and saying this to students, and eyes lit up. They couldn't even fathom that was a possibility. Is that the strongest pitch? Bring it back to the local level of fiscal insecurity, because then people feel the shock that the entire nation might suffer as a result of inaction?
Listen, we're always looking for ways to explain this issue in terms that people can understand. And so I think you're right. There are a lot of household analogies. No household can run itself on a deficit for the foreseeable future, and no business can do that either. So whether you use a credit card analogy or a business underwater analogy, if you or I or one of our companies we were involved in was facing something like this, we deal with it immediately. When you're dealing with government and politics and policy, listen, you have more time. You can say, let's do it tomorrow and the next day and so forth, and you can divert these things. And that's really the danger of this. This is a long-term problem, and unfortunately, a lot of short-term issues come to fore, and they deal with a long-term problem later. So we're always looking for ways to explain it. We try to be realistic about the doomsday, so we do talk about what's dangerous about the debt. When you have a debt like this, there's interest expense is one of the key dangers. So over the next 10 years, we're going to spend about $6 trillion on interest alone. Many of us feel we need to invest more in our economy and growth and education and other key priorities, but every dollar we spend on interest is an investment in the past.
Is that a threat, foreign or domestic or both?
Well, it's an economic threat to have so much of your budget going toward interest, because it increases the tax burden and it decreases the amount of resources available for other more important priorities. So that's its economic challenge. But you bring up a question about foreigners. I think it becomes a national security challenge. As Admiral Mullen once said, the famous quote, "The biggest threat to our national security is our debt." Today, foreigners own close to half our debt. And to me, that becomes a national security question if it continues to run out of control. And if we're trying to be a global leader in the free world and bring together adversaries and so forth, our power is diminished if we owe all these people trillions of dollars, or all these governments trillions of dollars. So I think the fact that foreigners are owning more and more of our debt does put us in a more precarious position in the international community. So that does become an international issue.
Do you draw any analogy or see the parallel, especially when you're catering now with this new initiative to millennials, climate change?
I think there are similarities. The climate change issue is a classic long-term challenge. What do I do about today? I can't make a difference, and we'll worry about it later, and so forth. It's the kind of thing you can put off. We're not going to have destruction of the planet next week. So it's a similar challenge in that it's long-term and a little abstract, and people don't quite understand it, and they want to get on with their daily lives. So I think that community has probably some similar challenges in trying to raise awareness and accelerate action. And
so financial literacy becomes a hugely significant issue.
Yeah, so as you said, one of the things we're working hard on is try to get millennials more involved in this issue, okay? So it's their future we're talking about. This could affect us in the short term, but more than likely it's a bigger problem the further you go out. So if you're the 20-something today thinking about the peak and important moments of your career, that's when a lot of this stuff will really come to affect the economy even more than it may already be doing. So we've worked a lot on ways to get young people in terms of financial literacy. We developed a high school curriculum on fiscal. We worked with Columbia Teachers College to develop a high school curriculum, which is being rolled out nationally today. And then we've done something really fun and interesting the last few years, which is something that we call Up to Us. And this is our third year running it, and it's a college competition on college campuses to run fiscal awareness campaigns. So this year we have close to 50 colleges participating. And these kids get very active, and we hold about a month-long competition, and we give them a budget, and they can run different events on campus, from something this year called Dance to the Dead and Debt Bingo, and they invite congressional leaders to campus to have real policy discussions. So there's a wide range of very creative, fun, interesting, a lot of use of social media, as you can imagine. We had something called My 2 Cents Day, where they had a huge amount of activity on social media. And the goal of that is to bring millennials into the conversation and help them realize that this is an issue that affects them. I would argue it affects them today because this huge threat lowers confidence and investment in today's economy, but it certainly affects them on our current path, as they progress through their lives. And so bringing them into the conversation is critically important because they have a lot to say. They have a big stake in the solution here and the positive outcome that we can hopefully achieve. And if we don't, they're the ones who are going to have to bear most of the burden of it. So it's very important for us to bring them in.
Let's hope they don't have to, and they awaken and are responsive to your message. Michael Peterson, thanks so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
And thanks to you in the audience. I hope you join us again next time for a thoughtful excursion into the world of ideas. Until then, keep an open mind. Please visit the Open Mind website at 13.org/openmind to view this program online or to access over 1,500 other Open Mind interviews. And do check us out on Twitter and Facebook at Open Mind TV for updates on future programming.
Continuing production of The Open Mind has been made possible by grants from Anne Olnick Gumowitz, the Angelson Family Foundation, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, the Joan, Ganz, Cooney and Peter G. Peterson Fund, the Rosalind P. Walter Foundation, the Joanne and Kenneth Wellner Foundation, Sally Minard and Norton Garfinkle, with special thanks to the Schumann Media Center for additional support, and from the corporate community, Mutual of America.